On Monday, the 20th of August, long-simmering tensions in Indonesia finally bubbled to the surface. Thousands took to the streets of Jakarta to protest against what they saw as a government intent on enriching itself at the expense of the ordinary people. The protesters, some carrying pirate flags from the anime One Piece, had one target in their sights: Parliament. 1,250 police officers were deployed to guard the building and were soon engaging in running battles with angry demonstrators. On one side, tear gas and water cannons were deployed. On the other, angry citizens were lighting fires and hurling rocks. Little could anyone have guessed that these scenes of carnage were only the beginning. In the days that followed, the protests swelled, transforming what began as a local outburst into a national movement that experts have described as the greatest test for President Prabowo Subianto. The scenes coming out of Jakarta are grim. Protesters have been killed, buildings torched, politicians' houses have been looted, and thousands have been arrested. If recent history is any indicator, things will only get worse before they get better. So how did Indonesia spiral into this crisis? And is there any way out? Tensions have been high in Indonesia since President Subianto's government introduced massive spending cuts in February to fund his signature free nutritious meals program. The cuts and subsequent unemployment exacerbated an existing cost of living crisis. To make matters worse, local governments began imposing higher property taxes to address the budgetary shortfalls caused by President Subianto's cuts. There was also a lot of anger after the government pushed through a controversial amendment to allow serving military officers to hold crucial civilian posts. The amendment raised fears that President Subianto, a former army general and son-in-law of the former dictator Suharto, was dragging the nation back to the dark days of military rule. So, you can imagine the outrage when amidst these conditions, Indonesian parliamentarians started receiving a monthly housing allowance of 50 million rupiah. That's approximately $3,000 in addition to their salaries. The allowance, introduced last year, is, according to Al Jazeera, almost 10 times the Jakarta minimum wage and about 20 times the monthly minimum wage in poorer areas of the country. And these figures may even be on the low end. According to analysis by the Indonesian Forum for Budget Transparency, an NGO that carries out oversight of the state's budget, parliamentarians may now be taking home 230 million rupiah monthly. That's about $13,940. For most Indonesians, the issue wasn't how high the figure was, rather it was the sheer audacity of politicians rewarding themselves at a time when ordinary citizens were struggling to survive. And we mean survive. Just days before this news broke, a story went viral on Indonesian social media of a 4-year-old girl called Raya who died from tuberculosis exacerbated by malnutrition and roundworms. The fact that a child could die of malnutrition while those in government enriched themselves made the whole nation not just angry, it made them livid. Like, really livid. Unfortunately, it was onto this smouldering flame of public outrage that Indonesia's MPs decided to pour an industrial quantity of gasoline. Responding to the growing controversy, Abigail Lemuria, co-founder of the digital media platform WhatsApp Indonesia, claimed that one MP dismissed the vast gulf between their salary and those of ordinary people by saying, "Wait for it, do not compare us to the commoners." You said the quiet part out loud, my dude. What the hell are you doing? Another MP, Ahmad Saroni, described those who were calling for the dissolution of parliament in response to these exorbitant perks as, quoting here, "the dumbest people in the world." Those people who voted you in, by the way. While most commentators point to the allowance as the main cause of the people's anger, Abigail believes that it's the arrogance from public officials more than anything else that drove people to the streets. And they soon hit the streets in the thousands. On Wednesday, the 27th of August, protesters in West Kalimantan province, led by the Tanjung Pura University Students' Council, marched to the regional parliament demanding an end to the housing allowance. At first, the protests were peaceful, but after the police fired tear gas into the crowd, the demonstration erupted into violence. 15 people were arrested, but were released 2 days later after signing a pledge promising not to repeat their actions. At this point, most of the protesters were either students or members of labor unions. While the rest of the nation was angry at the members of parliament, they hadn't taken to the streets yet. That would all change on the 28th of August. Now, before I tell you about the 28th of August, I have to introduce you to a man named Afan Kurnawan. Afan was a motorcycle taxi driver who worked for Gojek, an on-demand multi-service platform and digital payment technology group. He lived with his family of 7 in a rented house in the Menteng area of central Jakarta and was the household's main breadwinner. According to information shared by Katadata, a digital media, data and research company, Afan worked as a security guard before joining Gojek, which he viewed as a more flexible job that could better support his family. You'll notice there that we're speaking about Afan in the past tense, and that's because he died during the protests on the night of the 28th. And it would be his death more than anything that turned the white-hot anger of the protesters into a nuclear inferno. Initially, the day started calmly enough. Protesters, mainly students, political activists, and labor union members, led by labor groups such as the Coalition of Labor Unions and the Labour Party, had gathered in Jakarta with a list of demands for the government. At the top of their list, they wanted an end to outsourcing, a practice in which companies hire workers through third-party agencies on short-term contracts, denying them protections, wages, and stability that full-time employees receive. They also wanted the minimum wage to be raised, for mass layoffs to end, and for labor taxes to be reformed. Outside of Jakarta, protests with similar demands occurred in several major cities, including Surabaya, Medan, Mojokerto, and Gorontalo. The Jakarta protesters marched to parliament, and at first things were peaceful. Tensions only raised, and some of the students tried to break into the building while others threw objects. Police responded as they always do, with friendly words. No, they didn't. They used tear gas, high-pressure water cannons, and rubber bullets. But rather than disperse, the crowd only became more enraged. Clashes spread from the Parliament complex to a nearby shopping district, onto a major expressway and railway line, disrupting public transport and causing closures of the Palmera and Tanah Abang train stations. Hundreds of students were arrested, and those who managed to escape withdrew to the Angola Protestant Christian Church in the Pajompongan. It was through this chaos that Afan had the misfortune to come while fulfilling a delivery. By the time he reached the area, the police had already called in the Mobile Brigade, the special operations, paramilitary, and tactical unit of the National Police Force. Driving a 4x4 armored vehicle, one member of the brigade plowed straight into Afan. What happened next would be captured on 1,000 viral videos. Although the vehicle stopped after hitting him, it then sped away as an angry crowd formed, once again running over Afan. According to an eyewitness, the young man had tried to get to his feet, but he never stood a chance once the driver hit the gas. Afan was rushed to a local hospital where the doctors pronounced him dead at 7:50 p.m. local time. Another online delivery driver, Mo Amar Umrudin, was also hit by the Mobile Brigade unit, and according to local news outlet Detik News, was in hospital nursing his injuries. Like Afan, Mo wasn't a protester. He was at work, fulfilling a delivery. The reaction to Afan's death was immediate. The protesters chased down the tactical vehicle before encircling and trying to storm the Mobile Brigade's headquarters. That they were unsuccessful only added to their anger. A hashtag that roughly translates as "Police, the People's Killer," quickly topped social media in Indonesia. One commenter, Verdika Rizky Utama, compared Afan's death to the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre in China. Writing in Compass, a national newspaper published in Jakarta, Verdika posited that Afan's death was not an accident, but rather part of a systemic pattern of repression by a government that wields the police as a cudgel against dissent. He urged the police to stand up against government oppression because no one was safe, not even a delivery driver just doing his job. Afan was buried on the 29th of August, escorted by hundreds of motorcycle riders. The government, realizing that the funeral could become a flashpoint, sent a representative, the chief of Jakarta Police, Asap Edi Sahari. And while you could imagine a universe in which a representative of the force that killed Afan attending his funeral was all chill, in this universe it very nearly led to a riot. What followed was damage control on steroids. President Prabowo Subianto appeared on television expressing sorrow for the delivery driver's death. The defense minister, Sajafri Sajamsodin, did a photo op, gifting Afan's family a house. But you know how the narrative sometimes gets away from politicians, leaving them forever about 24 hours behind the curve of public opinion? Well, that absolutely happened here. As stand-up comedian Panji Pragiwaksono declared, "Indonesians will no longer accept dialogue. We're now angry. You cannot dialogue with someone who is angry." The following days saw massive protests across the entire country, from Banda Aceh in the west to Manokwari in the east. Buildings were torched, including one in which 3 people reportedly burned to death. In response, the president directed the armed forces and police to take firm action. Soon after, the chief of police authorized the use of rubber bullets and non-lethal weapons on anarchists entering police bases and dormitories. Hundreds of university students staged a demonstration outside the National Police headquarters demanding the removal of the chief of police. Made Supratma, visiting fellow at Singapore's ICS Yusof Ishak Institute, believes that removing the chief of police is one of the easiest things that the president can do to calm down the public. If I were the president, I'd remove the National Police chief from his post. The people need a symbolic gesture from him. The fact that the president still hadn't removed him from office at the time of recording, Tuesday afternoon, even after the death of a second protester, Reza Sendi Pratama, at the hands of the police, it seems to have confirmed the demonstrators' worst fears. Many Indonesians view this as emblematic of the deeper rot within the system, a government more concerned with preserving its own power structure than with delivering justice or restoring public trust. And so we come to the next major part of the protests, the part where the angry citizenry try to dispense justice themselves. On the 31st of August, crowds stormed the home of Finance Minister Sri Mulyani, stealing electronics, jewelry, and even a basketball ring. Soon after, they attacked the home of Ahmad Saroni. Remember him? He was the guy who called those upset by politicians' pay raises the dumbest people in the world. Well, his home was looted, and his sports car was destroyed live on TikTok. Oh no! In what has to be one of the fastest cases of instant karma in modern history. Nor were Saroni and Mulyani the only ones targeted. Celebrities also had their property ransacked, including Surya Atama, who had all 12 of his cats stolen by the rioters. Okay then. By September the 1st, it was estimated that at least 6 people had died in the riots, with another 20 going missing. But September the 1st also brought something unexpected, a moment of tense calm. Fearing a police crackdown, the All-Indonesian Student Executive Board, BEMSI, a student organization that had been at the forefront of organizing the protests, withdrew plans for an evening demonstration. Speaking to Compass, the organization's leaders indicated that plans for further protests were still on the table, but they were dependent on the security situation. As of the time of recording, an eerie sense of calm seems to have returned to Jakarta, underscored by the fact that members of parliament went back to work on Monday. Many Indonesians have been left asking, well, what's next? What did the protests actually achieve? Well, according to Gavin Butler, a reporter for the BBC, it's unclear where the protests will go from here. On the 1st of September, several high-profile social media figures published a list of demands named the 17+8 demands in tribute to Indonesian Independence Day, the 17th of August. They were directed at various government institutions and divided into 17 short-term goals to be fulfilled by the 5th of September 2025 and 8 long-term demands to be fulfilled by the 31st of August 2026. While we won't go into every single one, the 3 most important short-term demands, in our opinion, are number 1, the removal of the armed forces from civil law enforcement and ensure no criminalization of protesters. Number 2, freezing the pay raise and perks to the representatives and cancellation of new facilities. And 3, an end to the police brutality and for the force to adhere to standard operating procedure on demonstrators. The most important long-term ones, meanwhile, are number 1, implementing fairer tax reform, number 2, strengthening the National Commission on Human Rights and independent watchdogs, and number 3, leadership and systemic reform to the police forces to achieve more professional and humanist policing. At the time of writing, the government hasn't responded to the 17+8 demands. However, the president recently announced that Indonesia's political parties had reached a consensus to reduce lawmakers' benefits. What isn't clear is when the perks will be reduced or whether the decision will be enough to address the deep-rooted class issues in the country. It is the depth and breadth of these issues that has given the current anti-government rallies such force and set them apart from the many other protests that Indonesians have launched in recent years. In the view of Vedi Hadiz, professor of Asian Studies at the University of Melbourne's Asia Institute, this makes them, and we'll quote them here, among the most significant outbreak of protests since the advent of Reformasi, end quote. These are the reforms that followed the dictator Suharto's downfall in 1998. In other words, they're a once-in-a-generation upheaval. This sentiment is echoed by Dr. Eve Warburton, director of the Indonesia Institute at the Australian National University, who told the BBC, quote, "The current demonstrations are different. The grievances run deeper and are likely more broadly felt. The protests reflect people's sense of economic insecurity and pent-up resentment toward the greed and excesses of their elected officials." In the end, these protests have exposed a profound tension at the heart of Southeast Asia's largest economy. What happens next is going to depend on whether the Indonesian government treats this crisis as a passing storm or as the Category 5 hurricane that it truly is. If the ruling class now do the hard work of stormproofing their home, addressing the entrenched inequality and deep-seated anger it has inspired, then maybe they'll survive the next downpour. But if they simply trim a few salaries here and try to carry on without some serious work on the foundations, well, then they might find that the next gust of public anger is enough to blow the whole rotten edifice away. Thank you for watching.